Don't you die on me. You hear me? Don't you dare die on me. His hands were soaked in her blood. His knuckles were white. And the woman beneath him, the cop, the stranger, the enemy by every rule he'd ever lived by, was fading fast. Jake Matthews had stopped for a lot of things in his life, but he had never stopped for a cop. Tonight changed everything. If you're new here, hit subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this one travels. The rain came down like it had a grudge. Not the soft kind of rain that people in movies stand in when they're sad. This was the kind of rain that truck drivers cursed at, that sent semis fishtailing across the interstate, that turned two-lane state highways into rivers of black water and broken yellow lines. It was the kind of rain that made rational people stay inside, pour something warm, and thank God they weren't out in it. Jake Thunder Matthews was not a rational person, not by most definitions. He had been riding since he was 17 years old, and he had ridden in worse than this. He'd ridden through a hailstorm in Wyoming that left dents in his tank. He'd ridden through flash floods in Arizona and ice patches in Montana, and 60-mile-an-hour crosswinds in the Texas Panhandle that nearly put him sideways into a cattle fence. Rain didn't scare him. Rain was just weather. He leaned into it, kept his throttle steady, and let the Harley do what it was built to do. It was past midnight. The highway stretched out ahead of him, empty in both directions, the kind of empty that only exists in the dead hours between one world ending and another beginning. His headlight carved a tunnel through the dark. The asphalt shimmered. The white dashes on the road came at him in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, almost meditative, the kind of rhythm that long-distance riders knew in their bones. He'd been at a chapter meeting 2 counties over. 3 hours of business, argument, brotherhood, and the particular kind of noise that 12 strong-willed men in one room always generated. He was tired. His back ached. He wanted his bed and nothing else. That's when he saw the lights. Not headlights, not taillights. Something off the road, something low and wrong. A red and blue strobe pattern flickering weakly from the shallow drainage ditch on the right shoulder, like the last heartbeat of something that should have been dead already. He didn't even think. His right hand rolled off the throttle, his left squeezed the clutch, and his boots found the asphalt almost before he'd made the conscious decision to stop. He pulled to the shoulder, cut the engine, sat for exactly 1 second, listening to the rain. Then he swung his leg off the bike and walked toward it. The cruiser had left the road at speed. He could see that immediately from the way the grass was torn up along the shoulder, the way the crash barrier on the far side was buckled inward, the way the vehicle had rolled at least once before landing on its side in the ditch. The roof lights were still cycling. The radio inside was still crackling, a dispatcher's voice cutting in and out through static, saying something that the rain swallowed whole. Jake slid down the embankment, his boots sinking into wet grass, one hand on the ground to keep his balance. He came around to the driver's side, which was now the top side, and that's when he saw her. The window had shattered. She was half out of it, or half hanging in it. It was hard to tell in that light, hard to tell which way was up when the whole world had been turned sideways. Her uniform jacket was dark with something that wasn't just rainwater. Her head was down. Her hand was loose against the doorframe. "Hey," Jake said, loud, sharp, the way you say it when you need someone to hear you from underwater. "Hey, look at me." Nothing. He grabbed the doorframe and pulled himself up, looked in. She was young, maybe late 20s, early 30s. He couldn't tell for certain in the strobing light. Seatbelt still on, body slumped sideways against what used to be the passenger window and was now just a frame full of broken glass and rain. There was a wound. He didn't need medical training to see that much. On her left side, somewhere below the ribs, where the steering wheel or the door or God knows what had done its work on her. Blood, a lot of it, the kind that kept coming. "Hey!" He reached in, touched her face, tapped her cheek. "Open your eyes, right now, open them." Her eyelids moved, just barely, a flutter, like something inside her was hearing him from a long distance and trying to fight its way back. "There you go," he said. "There you go. Stay with me." Her eyes opened halfway, brown eyes, unfocused. She looked at him the way people look when they're not quite sure if what they're seeing is real. "Who?" she started. "Doesn't matter," Jake said. "Can you move your hands?" She tried. Her right hand shifted, scraped against the broken glass. She winced, a small, involuntary sound, and he could see that register across her face. Pain was good. Pain meant she was still in there somewhere. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I need you to stay awake. You hear me? Don't close your eyes." He already had his phone out. The signal was weak. 2 bars, then 1, then 2 again. And for a moment he just stared at the screen with the particular fury of a man who knows that the next 10 seconds matter and that technology is failing him at the exact wrong moment. The call connected on the 3rd try. 911, what is your emergency? I've got an officer down on State Route 9, about 6 miles south of the Route 9 and Caldwell Road intersection. Single vehicle rollover. Officer is in the vehicle. She's got a serious abdominal wound. She's losing blood fast. I need an ambulance right now. Sir, can you confirm your location? 6 miles south of Caldwell Road on Route 9, he said again, slower, harder. There's a patrol cruiser in the ditch on the east side of the road. Light's still going. You'll see it. Send everybody. Are you with the officer now? I'm with her. Can you tell me her condition? She's conscious, but she's fading. She's got a wound on her left side, below the ribs. It's bad. Sir, are you trained in first aid? Jake looked at his hands, at the blood already on them from where he'd touched her face, her shoulder, the doorframe. He looked at the wound and at the rain coming in through the broken windows, and at the radio still crackling that useless static. Enough, he said. He ended the call and shoved the phone in his jacket pocket. Then he stripped off his cut, his Hell's Angels vest, the thing he'd worn for 18 years, the thing that was as much a part of him as his own skin, and he set it aside. And then he pulled his flannel shirt over his head and balled it in his fist, and he reached in through the broken window and pressed it as hard as he could against her side. She gasped. Her whole body went rigid with it. I know, Jake said. I know it hurts. That means you're still here. Keep it that way. Who are you? She managed. Not quite a question. More like her brain was trying to process too many things at once, and the words were just spillover. My name's Jake. I'm going to keep pressure on this until help gets here. I need you to keep talking to me. What's your name? A long pause. The rain hammered the overturned cruiser like it was trying to beat it further into the ground. Blake, she said. Rachel Blake. How long have you been on the job, Rachel? Another pause. She was working for it now, he could see that. Working to stay conscious. Working to hold on to the thread of conversation like it was a rope and the darkness was pulling her down. 7 years, she said. 7 years, Jake repeated. You don't make it 7 years by giving up in a ditch on a Tuesday night. You understand me? Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile, something closer to stubborn. It's Wednesday, she said. 12:15. There she is, Jake said. Stay right there. He kept the pressure on. His arms ached from the angle, from holding himself half inside the window, half on the wet slope of the embankment, every muscle working against gravity and rain and his own exhaustion. He didn't let up. He talked to her. He talked because silence was the enemy right now, because silence was what the darkness sounded like, because as long as he was talking and she was answering, they were both still in it. He asked her stupid questions, favorite food, where she grew up, how long she'd been on this particular route, and she answered them slowly, with long pauses, but she answered them. Her voice got stronger in moments and then weaker again, and every time it dipped, he pushed a little harder on the wound and said her name a little louder, and every time she came back, You a Hell's Angel, she said at some point. Not an accusation, just a fact she was processing. Yeah, I've arrested Hell's Angels before. I know you have. You still stopped. Wasn't really a decision, Jake said. She was quiet for a moment. The radio crackled. Far off, through the curtain of rain, he thought he could hear something. A siren, maybe, or maybe just the wind playing tricks. Why not? She said. It wasn't quite a question, and it wasn't quite a statement. It was the thing you say when you're trying to understand something that doesn't fit the map you've been using your whole life. Jake thought about that for a second, about all the ways he could answer it, about the version of himself that existed in police reports and courthouse documents, and the particular way that certain cops looked at him when he pulled into a gas station. The look that said they'd already decided who he was before he'd opened his mouth. Because you were bleeding, he said. That's it. That's the whole reason. She didn't say anything to that. Maybe she was saving her energy. Maybe there wasn't anything to say. The sirens got louder. The first unit came over the rise doing 60 and hit the brakes hard when the driver saw Jake's bike on the shoulder and the strobing lights in the ditch. 2 more units behind it, then a fire engine, then the ambulance. They came down the embankment fast, flashlights cutting through the rain, hands on weapons, because that's what they saw when they crested the hill. A man in a Hell's Angels cut kneeling over a downed officer, and that was not a picture that computed cleanly. Hands! Let me see your hands! Jake turned his head slowly. He did not move his hands from the wound. If I take my hands off her side, she dies, he said. It was not a threat. It was not a challenge. It was a fact delivered in the flattest, most certain voice he possessed. She's got a wound below the left rib. She's lost significant blood. I've been holding pressure for about 12 minutes. You want to take over? I will move the second your medic gets his hands on her, not before. A beat of silence. The kind of silence that happens when reality refuses to line up with expectation. One of the officers, older, gray at the temples, sergeant stripes, stepped forward and looked past Jake into the overturned cruiser. He saw Rachel Blake. He saw the blood. He saw Jake's shirt pressed against her side and Jake's arms shaking with the effort of holding it there. "Where's my medic?" the sergeant bellowed over his shoulder. The paramedic was already sliding down the embankment with his bag. He came up beside Jake, took one look at the situation, and without a word put his own hands over Jake's. Jake held steady until he felt the other man's grip take the pressure, and then he pulled back, slowly, carefully, and sat back on his heels in the wet grass. His hands were covered in blood. His bare arms were covered in blood. His flannel shirt was ruined, still pressed against her side by the medic's hands, and he was sitting in a ditch in the rain without a shirt in 40-degree weather, and he didn't particularly feel any of it. The sergeant was standing over him, hands still near his weapon, eyes hard and unreadable. "You want to tell me what happened here?" the sergeant said. "I was riding south on Route 9. I saw the lights in the ditch. I pulled over." "You just pulled over?" "Yes." "And you called it in?" "Yes." "And you put pressure on the wound?" "Yes." The sergeant looked at him for a long time. At the cut on the ground beside Jake, wings and bottom rocker clearly visible even in the rain. At the Harley on the shoulder above them. At Jake's bare arms and the tattoos covering them, and the blood covering everything. "You got ID?" the sergeant said. "Inside pocket of my cut," Jake said. "I'll reach for it slow." He did. He handed over his license. The sergeant looked at it, looked at him, looked at it again. "Jake Matthews. That's right. You a member?" 18 years. A younger officer had come up beside the sergeant. He was maybe 25, and his hand was not near his weapon. It was on his weapon, and he was looking at Jake with the particular expression of someone who had been told a story about what this moment was supposed to look like, and was disturbed to find that the story didn't match. "Sarge," the young officer said, his voice low. "You want me to?" "Stand down," the sergeant said. Not harshly, just firmly. He kept his eyes on Jake. Mr. Matthews, how long were you with her before we arrived? 12, maybe 13 minutes from when I got to the vehicle. Add another 2 or 3 minutes from when I first stopped to when I actually got to her. She conscious the whole time? She went in and out in the first few minutes. Once I got her talking, she stayed with me. She say anything? About the accident? About what happened? No, I kept her talking, kept her awake. The sergeant looked down at Rachel Blake, who was now surrounded by paramedics, who was getting an IV line and a neck brace, and all the machinery of survival deployed around her with fierce efficiency. Then he looked back at Jake. All right, he said. He handed back the license. Don't go anywhere. I wasn't planning on it, Jake said. Someone brought a blanket from one of the units, a thermal emergency blanket, the crinkly silver kind, and held it out toward Jake. He looked up. It was the young officer, the one with his hand on his weapon. He wasn't holding his weapon now. He was holding the blanket, and his expression had shifted into something more complicated and harder to name. Jake took the blanket, wrapped it around his shoulders. Thanks, he said. The young officer nodded once and walked away without a word. They loaded Rachel Blake into the ambulance. Before the doors closed, Jake heard one of the paramedics say something about blood pressure, something about units on standby at the hospital, something about getting on the phone with the trauma surgeon. The words came at him in fragments. He held on to the ones that mattered. She was alive. She was in there. She was still fighting. The ambulance pulled away. The rain kept coming. The red and blue lights of half a dozen patrol units turned the wet road into something almost beautiful, almost alien. Jake sat on the embankment wrapped in his silver blanket and watched them work. Watched the officers process the scene. Watched the sergeant make calls on his radio. Watched the younger officers move around the perimeter with their flashlights and their yellow tape and their careful, professional faces that couldn't quite hide the thing underneath. The thing that was confusion or discomfort or something they hadn't been given vocabulary for yet. One of them, a woman, early 40s, staff sergeant insignia, came and sat beside him on the embankment. Not across from him, not standing over him. She just came and sat beside him in the rain, in the mud, and looked at the ambulance's taillights disappearing down the highway. She's strong, the woman said. Rachel Blake. I've known her 6 years. She's strong. I could tell, Jake said. The woman looked at him sideways, assessing, the kind of look that takes in more than just the surface. You didn't have to stop, she said. Yeah, Jake said, I did. She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked away, back at the road, back at the place where the ambulance had been. Thank you, she said. Jake didn't say anything. He pulled the silver blanket tighter and looked at his hands, at the blood drying under his nails, in the creases of his knuckles, in the lines of his palms. And he thought about a lot of things that didn't arrange themselves into words. 3 hours later, standing under the fluorescent lights of a hospital waiting room, with a styrofoam cup of coffee going cold in his hand, he got the news from a nurse who clearly wasn't sure what to make of him. Rachel Blake was out of surgery. She was in critical but stable condition. She was going to need time, but she was alive. Jake drank the cold coffee, put the cup in the trash, picked up his cut from the chair where he draped it, still damp, smelling of rain and exhaust and the particular smell of 18 years of road, and put it on. He rode home in the gray pre-dawn, the rain finally giving way to something quieter, the highway empty and wide and his. Nobody stopped him. Nobody flagged him down. Nobody needed him for anything, which was fine. He'd done what he came to do. What he didn't know, what none of them knew yet, not the sergeant, not the young officer with the blanket, not the staff sergeant who sat with him in the rain, was what came next. What it would mean in the days that followed for the woman in that hospital room and the man who'd pulled her out of the dark. What it would mean for two worlds that had spent a long time deciding they had nothing to say to each other. That was still coming, and nothing about it was going to be simple. The sergeant's name was Dale Pruitt, and he had been with the Hargrove County Sheriff's Department for 22 years. He had seen things in those 22 years that most people wouldn't believe, things that had rearranged his understanding of human beings in ways he was still working through. But when he sat down at his desk the next morning with a cup of coffee and pulled up the traffic camera footage from Route 9, what he saw stopped him cold. He watched it 3 times before he called anyone else in. The footage was grainy, county cameras always were, always underfunded, always one budget cycle away from an upgrade that never came. But it was clear enough. Clear enough to see Jake Matthews' headlight appear at the top of the frame, slow down, stop. Clear enough to see him get off the bike and move to the ditch. Clear enough to see him on his phone, and then the shirt coming off, and then 12 minutes of a man holding another person together with nothing but his hands and his will, while the rain came down and nobody else was anywhere on that road. Pruitt sat back in his chair. He was not a man who revised his opinions quickly. He had opinions about motorcycle clubs the way most law enforcement did. Opinions built from incident reports and arrest records and a career's worth of hard-won experience. He did not think those opinions were wrong. He thought they were accurate on the whole and professionally necessary. But he also believed in what he saw with his own eyes. He believed in evidence. He believed in the thing that actually happened, regardless of whether it fit neatly inside the framework he'd built to understand the world. He picked up his phone and called the hospital. Rachel Blake was awake. She had been awake since 6 in the morning, which her surgeon had called remarkable, and her nurses had called inconvenient, because she kept trying to pull out her IV and ask questions that nobody wanted to answer at 6 in the morning. The surgeon had used the word fortunate 4 times in their conversation, each time with the particular emphasis of someone who means something closer to miraculous, but who has a professional obligation to stay in the range of the scientifically defensible. She had lost a significant amount of blood. The wound had done damage to soft tissue that would take weeks to heal properly. She would be in the hospital for at least 10 days, and after that, desk duty for as long as it took. And she had been informed of this in the gentle but non-negotiable tone of someone who had heard every argument against desk duty and had no interest in hearing them again. She had nodded and said yes and thank you, and then the moment the surgeon left the room, she had turned to Pruitt and said, "Tell me about the man who stopped." Pruitt pulled a chair to the side of her bed. He sat down the way older men sit when they're carrying something and are ready to put it down. He told her what the footage showed. He told her the name. He told her the patch on the cut and the 18 years and the blood on the hands and the silver blanket and the cold coffee in the waiting room. Rachel listened to all of it without interrupting. Her face was harder to read than usual, which Pruitt attributed to the painkillers, but her eyes were sharp. Her eyes were always sharp. "He stayed at the hospital," she said. It wasn't a question. "Until about 4 in the morning. Left after the nurse told him you were stable. And then? Rode home, far as we can tell. No statement? No, he didn't want anything? He gave a statement at the scene, voluntary, cooperative, answered everything we asked, declined to come to the station, but offered to if we needed a formal follow-up." Pruitt paused. "We haven't contacted him since." Rachel looked at the ceiling. A long moment passed between them, the kind that happens when 2 people are thinking through the same thing from opposite ends and haven't quite met in the middle yet. "He could have kept writing," she said. "Yes," Pruitt said. "He could have. Nobody would have known. No cameras until the county line. He could have been 2 miles gone before the next car came through." "Yes, but he stopped." He stopped. Another silence. Outside the room, the hospital made its usual noises. The PA system, the distant rolling of a cart, a voice somewhere down the corridor asking a question that the walls absorbed before it could arrive with any meaning. "I want to talk to him," Rachel said. Pruitt looked at her. He knew better than to argue, which was one of the reasons he and Rachel Blake had always gotten along better than she got along with most of the supervisory staff. He knew which fights were worth having. "I'll pass the word," he said. What he did not tell Rachel, not yet, not while she was still in a hospital bed with a drainage tube in her side and a morphine drip doing its quiet work, was what was happening on the other side of the building. In the waiting area near the elevator bank on the second floor, where the coffee machine was broken and the chairs were the particular shade of beige that hospitals seemed to believe promoted calm, a cluster of off-duty officers had gathered, not to visit Rachel, or not only to visit Rachel, to talk. Pruitt had walked through that cluster on his way in. He had heard enough to know what the conversation was. He had heard the name Matthews repeated in voices that ranged from grudging to hostile, had heard the words, "still doesn't mean anything," and "one good act," and "you know who those people are," had heard a younger officer he'd supervised for 3 years say, "I don't care what he did, I know what that patch means," and had felt the particular exhaustion of a man who knows that the truth is more complicated than the argument people are having about it. He had not intervened. Not then. There was a time for that, and this wasn't it. What he didn't know was that Corporal Dana Yates had already been on the phone for an hour. Dana Yates was 38 years old and had been with the department for 11 years, and was, by nearly universal agreement among her colleagues, the most relentlessly efficient human being any of them had ever encountered. She had been 2 units behind the first responders the night before, had arrived at the scene in time to see Jake Matthews sitting in the wet grass, wrapped in a silver blanket, had been the one who sat beside him on the embankment and said, "Thank you," while the rain came down. She had gone home at 5 in the morning and slept for exactly 4 hours and then gotten up and started making calls. By the time Pruitt was sitting with Rachel, Dana Yates had already spoken to the department's public information officer, to a journalist she trusted at the county paper, and to 3 other officers who had been on scene the previous night. She had not asked any of them to do anything in particular. She had simply told them what she saw. She was a factual person by nature and by training, and the facts, laid out plainly, had a weight that editorializing would have only diluted. The response had been, in her own words, more than I expected. She found out later that the journalist had posted a short account online before noon. She found out later that it had been shared widely by that evening. She found out later that by the time visiting hours began at the hospital that day, there were flowers at the front desk addressed to Officer Rachel Blake from people she didn't know, from towns she'd never been to, from a woman in Minnesota who wrote in her card simply, "Tell that biker thank you from me." None of that had reached Rachel yet. Rachel was dealing with something more immediate. The young officer who had handed Jake the blanket the night before, his name was Calloway, first year out of the academy, 24 years old, and still in the phase of his career where everything felt like a test of who he was going to be, had come to see her. He had stood in the doorway of her room with his hat in his hands and the specific awkwardness of someone who had something to say and wasn't sure he had the right to say it. "You can come in, Calloway," Rachel said. He came in. He stood at the foot of the bed. He looked at her the way younger officers always looked at her in the hospital. Like the sight of her in that bed was rearranging something structural inside them. Like the vulnerability of it disturbed their understanding of how the world was supposed to work. "I wanted to check on you," he said. "I'm fine. I'll be fine." She watched him. "That's not the only reason you came." He turned his hat in his hands, a slow rotation once around. "No," he said. "Say it." He looked up. "I had my hand on my weapon," he said. "When we came down the embankment, I saw him and I had my hand on it, and he didn't even look at me. He just kept holding pressure on your side and told us what was wrong with you, and I—" He stopped. The hat rotated again. "I don't know what I would have done." "You would have made the right call," Rachel said. "I don't know that." "Calloway, I'm serious. I don't know that, because I'd already decided what I was looking at before I got to the bottom of that embankment. I'd already decided who he was. He looked at her directly, and I was wrong. The room was quiet for a moment. The monitor beside her bed kept its steady count. Yeah, Rachel said. We're going to have to sit with that one. He nodded, still turning the hat. Then he said, he asked about you before he left. The nurse wouldn't tell him anything official, patient privacy, but he stopped her in the hallway and he said, just tell me if she's still in there. And she told him yes. And he said, okay, and walked out. Rachel looked at the window, at the gray morning light coming through the blinds. Just tell me if she's still in there, she repeated quietly. Yeah. She didn't say anything else for a moment. Calloway stayed where he was, hat in hand, waiting, not for permission to leave, but for something he couldn't quite name, some resolution to a thing that hadn't finished resolving. You did the right thing with the blanket, Rachel said finally. That's a low bar. It's a start, she said. Go home, get some sleep. He went, and Rachel lay back against the pillow and closed her eyes and thought about a man she'd never met before last night, a man who existed in a category she had spent 7 years of her career treating as an adversary, a man who had pressed his shirt against her side for 13 minutes in a cold rain and talked to her about nothing at all, just to keep her on the right side of consciousness. She thought about his voice, the particular flatness of it, the lack of performance in it. He hadn't been trying to be a hero. He hadn't been trying to prove anything. He'd just been doing the thing that needed doing, in the manner of someone who didn't know how to do it any other way. She thought about that for a long time. Meanwhile, across town, Jake Matthews was in his garage. He was not hiding. He did not hide from things. It wasn't in his nature, and it wasn't something the life he'd lived had left him much room for. But he was also not seeking anything out. He had come home, slept 4 hours, eaten something he couldn't have described afterward, and then gone to the garage, where his secondary bike, a '92 Sportster he'd been rebuilding for 18 months, was waiting for him in its usual state of ambitious disassembly. He worked on it the way he'd always worked on things, methodically, quietly, with his hands occupied so his mind could do what it needed to do. His phone had been ringing since 9 in the morning. Chapter members, brothers asking what happened, asking if he was all right, asking questions that ranged from concerned to cautious, to one from a man called Dozer who simply said, "You saved a cop," in the tone of someone reading a particularly strange headline out loud, just to hear how it sounded. "Yeah," Jake said. "How do you feel about that?" "Fine." "Seriously." "Dozer, I feel fine. She needed help. I helped her. That's the whole story." A pause on the other end. The sound of Dozer processing this in the way Dozer processed everything. Slowly, thoroughly, with the methodical consideration of a man who had learned the hard way not to react quickly to things. "Some of the guys are saying it's going to be a problem," Dozer said, "with with certain people. They're saying it looks like you're getting friendly with law enforcement." Jake set down the wrench he was holding. He picked it back up. He set it down again. "I didn't get friendly with law enforcement," he said. "I stopped a person from dying. If certain people have a problem with that, they can bring it to me directly and we'll have a conversation about it." Another pause. "Okay," Dozer said. "Just wanted you to know." "I know. I'll talk to you later." He ended the call. He looked at the Sportster. He picked up the wrench. His phone rang again. Number he didn't recognize. Area code he did. It was local. He almost didn't answer. He almost let it go to voicemail and dealt with it later. He didn't know what made him answer it. Instinct, maybe, or something else. "Matthews," he said. "Mr. Matthews." The voice was measured, deliberate, the voice of someone accustomed to conversations where the words needed to carry weight. "This is Sergeant Dale Pruitt, Hargrove County. We spoke last night at the scene." "I remember. I wanted to reach out personally. I've reviewed the traffic camera footage from the scene. I want you to know that everything you told us on site is confirmed in full. You were there first. You acted immediately. What you did for Officer Blake, that was the difference, Mr. Matthews. The paramedics were very clear about that. Jake didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what there was to say. I also want to tell you, Pruitt continued, and here his voice shifted slightly, the professional formality softening around the edges into something more plainly human, that Officer Blake is awake, and she's asking for you. The wrench in Jake's hand was very still. She's asking for me, he said. Yes, sir. Why? A beat. I think, Pruitt said, that's something she'd like to answer herself. Jake looked at the Sportster, at the half-assembled engine, the parts laid out in order on the shop cloth, the work waiting to be done. He had been in harder situations than this. He had walked into rooms where people wanted to hurt him and had walked out the other side. He had said things to people who didn't want to hear them and had stood by those things regardless. He was not a man who was easily made uncertain. And yet something about this, about the idea of walking into that hospital room, facing that woman, navigating whatever came next between the world she represented and the world he lived in, made him feel something he couldn't immediately name. Not fear, not reluctance, something more complicated than either of those. I'll come tonight, he said, after visiting hours. I'll come to the front desk and give my name. I'll make sure they're expecting you, Pruitt said. He hung up. Jake put the phone down on the workbench. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked up the wrench, turned back to the Sportster, and got back to work. Whatever was coming could wait until tonight. It had waited this long. One more afternoon wasn't going to change the shape of it. But he knew, with the same certainty he'd felt on that rain-soaked highway when he'd seen the lights in the ditch and made the decision to stop, that whatever was coming was going to matter. That this was not a story that ended with a hospital discharge and a handshake and everyone going back to their separate corners. He knew it the same way he knew when a storm was building, by the feel of the air, by the pressure in the atmosphere that hadn't broken yet, but was going to. He tightened the bolt, put his back into it, and waited for tonight. He arrived at 7:45. Visiting hours technically ended at 8, which gave him 15 minutes of official cover and the understanding that Pruitt had already cleared the way for whatever came after. He walked through the front entrance with his cut on and his chin level and did not look sideways at the woman at the reception desk who looked sideways at him. He gave his name. She made a call. She told him, 3rd floor, room 318, and to follow the blue line on the floor. He followed the blue line. The elevator opened on a corridor that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. And the first thing Jake saw when the doors parted was a uniform. 2 uniforms. Officers posted outside a room at the far end of the hall, both of them turning to look at him the moment he stepped out. Both of them doing the same rapid calculation that officers always did when they saw him. The cut, the boots, the tattoos, the way he moved, and arriving at the same instinctive conclusion that they then had to consciously override based on whatever Pruitt had told them. Jake walked toward them at the same pace he'd been walking. Not slow, not fast, just walking. The taller of the 2 stepped forward slightly, not blocking, not yet, but present in a way that communicated intent without committing to it. Matthews, the officer said. That's right. A beat. The officer looked at his partner. Some communication passed between them that didn't require words. Then, she's expecting you. Keep it short. I'll keep it as long as she needs it, Jake said, and as short. He pushed open the door to room 318. Rachel Blake was sitting up in the bed, not lying down, not half reclined, sitting up, back straight, the particular posture of someone who has decided that being in a hospital bed does not mean being diminished by it. She had the IV line in her left arm and a monitor clipped to her finger and the specific pallor of someone who had recently lost a serious amount of blood and was in the early stages of arguing her way back to full. She looked, Jake thought, like someone who had been in a fight and was already planning the rematch. She looked at him when he came in. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had already been through something together and didn't need to establish themselves from scratch. "You came," she said. "You asked," he said. "Have a seat." He looked at the chair beside the bed. He sat in it. He put his hands on his knees and looked at her and waited, because this was her room and her conversation, and she had earned the right to start it wherever she wanted. "The surgeon told me I had about 4 minutes when you got to me," she said, "give or take, based on the blood loss and the wound location." She said it the way she might say anything, plainly, factually, looking at him without flinching. 4 minutes. "He told you that directly?" I asked him directly. "He's a good surgeon." He answered the question. She paused. 4 minutes, Jake, and you were 12 minutes away from any other help." He nodded slowly. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything useful to say to that, and he was not a man who filled silence with noise just to fill it. "I've been a cop for 7 years, Rachel said. "I have arrested 4 members of the Hells Angels. Not all from your chapter, but 4. She watched him. "Did you know that when you stopped?" "I didn't know anything about you when I stopped," Jake said. "I saw lights in the ditch." "That's it. That's it." She looked at him for a long moment. The monitor beeped. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. "I owe you my life," she said. "That's not a figure of speech. That's the actual, literal fact of the situation, and I needed to say it to your face, because saying it to Pruitt or putting it in a report didn't feel like enough." Jake leaned forward slightly in the chair, elbows on knees. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I didn't stop so I could be owed something." "I know that," she said. "That's part of why I needed to say it." He held her gaze. She held his. The particular thing that passed between them in that moment was not friendship exactly, and it was not the absence of all the history that existed between people like him and people like her. It was something more honest than either of those things. It was two people who had been on opposite sides of a line for so long that they'd almost forgotten the line was something they'd built, not something they'd found. "How are you doing?" Rachel asked. "With your people, your chapter. Is there going to be trouble for you?" Jake blinked. Of all the directions he'd expected this conversation to go, this was not one of them. "That's not your concern," he said. "Dozer called you," she said. He went very still. "How do you know about Dozer?" "I'm a cop, Jake. I'm injured, not retired." For the first time, the edge of something that might have been a smile moved across her face. "We know the chapter names. We know the structure. We're not as uninformed as people think." The almost smile faded. "I'm asking because I'm aware that what you did could put you in a complicated position with certain members. And I'm asking because whatever that complication is, I want to know if it's something I contributed to." Jake studied her. He was trying to decide if this was professional interest or something else, and he was finding that the two were more entangled than he'd expected. "There's some noise," he said finally. "Nothing I can't handle." "What kind of noise?" "The kind that says I crossed a line." "Did you?" "No," Jake said. "I saved a person. The line didn't come into it." Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then, "There are people in my department saying the same kind of thing, from the other direction. Saying you shouldn't have let a Hell's Angel hold pressure on your wound. Saying that the story shouldn't be celebrated. That giving a man like you recognition is the wrong message." She said it without heat, just reporting it the way she'd report anything. "I want you to know that those people don't speak for me." Jake sat back slightly. "I'm not looking for recognition," he said. "I don't need a plaque. I don't need a press release." "I know that too," she said. "That's also part of why I needed to say it." They were quiet again. Jake became aware that he had been in the room for almost 20 minutes, and the officers outside had not come in to remind him about visiting hours. and he understood that Pruitt had been more thorough in his preparations than he'd let on. He filed that away without comment. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead." "The accident, what happened? You don't have to." "A deer," Rachel said, flat, simple. The particular flatness of someone who has thought about a thing so many times in the last 24 hours that the emotional charge has temporarily burned out of it. "A deer came out of the tree line on my left. I swerved right, overcorrected, hit the gravel on the shoulder and lost it." She paused. 7 years on the road, all the things I've driven into and out of, and it was a deer on a Tuesday night. "Wednesday," Jake said. She looked at him. Then something broke loose in her expression. Not the almost smile this time, something fuller, something that reached her eyes. And she laughed, short and real and slightly painful, one hand moving to her side where the wound was. "Wednesday," she said, 12:15. "There she is," Jake said quietly. Rachel's laughter subsided. She looked at him with an expression that was harder to classify than anything that had come before. Something that was recognition and surprise, and a complicated kind of gratitude that went deeper than politeness. "You said that to me last night," she said. When I was going, you said that." "You came back when I said it," he said. "Figured it was worth keeping." She was quiet. The monitor kept its count. Jake looked at his hands, clean now, no evidence of the night before except in his memory, and looked back at her. "There's something you need to know," Rachel said. Her voice had shifted. The warmth was still there, but something else had come in behind it, something more serious. "Pruitt told me about the footage, the camera footage from Route 9. Okay? He also told me that he shared it with the department, the full timeline, you arriving, you on the phone, everything." She watched him carefully. "What he didn't tell you, because he only found out this morning, is that someone in the department shared it externally, with a journalist." Jake was very still. "It's online," Rachel said. "The story, your name is in it. Not the footage itself, but the account, the details, the shirt, the 12 minutes, all of it." She paused. "It's been shared about 40,000 times as of an hour ago." The number landed in the room with a weight Jake hadn't prepared for. He looked at her. She looked back at him, watching the thing move across his face. Not quite shock, not quite alarm, but something in the vicinity of a man who has just realized that the radius of his actions has extended far beyond the geography he thought he was in. "Who shared it?" he said. "I don't know. Pruitt is looking into it. But Jake..." She stopped. She chose her next words with care. "It doesn't matter who shared it. What matters is what happens next. Because once something gets that kind of traction, it takes on a life of its own. And the life this thing is taking on, the story of a Hell's Angel saving a cop, that story is going to arrive in places you're not ready for." "Such as?" Jake said. Not quite a question. "My captain called Pruitt an hour ago," Rachel said. "The department is getting media requests, 3 so far. And my captain, Captain Warren, who has been in this department for 30 years, and who has a particular set of opinions about motorcycle clubs that he has never been shy about expressing. My captain is apparently having a very uncomfortable morning." Jake almost smiled. "Good," he said. "Jake, I'm serious. If Warren is uncomfortable, that means the truth is doing what the truth is supposed to do." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to apologize for stopping on Route 9. I'm not going to walk it back because it's inconvenient for somebody's worldview." "I'm not asking you to," Rachel said, with a firmness that matched his own. "I'm telling you because you have a right to know, and because..." She paused again, and this time the pause was longer, and when she came back her voice was quieter, but no less certain. "Because there are people in my department who want to get ahead of this story, who want to shape it before it shapes itself. And some of those people are going to want to talk to you. And I think you should be prepared for the fact that not all of them have good intentions. Jake looked at her. You're warning me. I'm giving you information, she said. You can do what you want with it. That's a warning. She held his gaze. Yeah, she said, it is. He sat with that. With the strangeness of it, this woman, this cop, 7 years on the job and 4 arrests on the ledger between them, warning him about the machinery that was her own institution. He thought about all the versions of this conversation he could have imagined and how thoroughly this one had outrun all of them. Why are you telling me this? He said, and I'm asking for real, not rhetorically. Rachel's jaw tightened slightly. Because you didn't ask for any of this, she said. You stopped on a road and did the right thing, and the right thing turned into a story, and the story is going to turn into something with consequences you didn't sign up for. And that seems, she stopped. Look for the word. That seems unfair. Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful in a way it hadn't been before. Not guarded, but precise, like he was trying to get something right that mattered. Officer Blake, he said, I've been in this life for 18 years. I know how the machinery works. I know what happens when someone like me ends up in a story that someone else wants to tell. He leaned forward slightly. I'm not worried about the machinery. The machinery is going to do what it does. What I'm worried about is you, and whether this, he gestured at the room, at the IV, at everything, whether this is going to complicate your career in ways you didn't ask for either. She stared at him. A long beat of silence. You're worried about me, she said. You're the one in the hospital bed, he said. Something moved through her face then, something she didn't have a ready defense for, something that came in under the professionalism and the training and the 7 years of building the kind of composure that kept you functional in bad situations. Her eyes went briefly bright. She blinked it back with the practiced efficiency of someone who has had a lot of practice. I'll be fine, she said. I know, he said. You've still got 6 days of desk duty to survive. They said 10. You'll negotiate it to 6, he said. Maybe 5. She looked at him. The almost smile came back, fuller this time. You don't know me, she said. I know what I know, Jake said. The door opened behind him. One of the officers from the hallway, the taller one, leaned in with a specific expression of a man executing an uncomfortable obligation. Mr. Matthews, it's getting late. Jake nodded. He stood up from the chair, straightened his cut, and looked at Rachel Blake one more time. She looked back at him with an expression that was neither simple nor easy to name. An expression that existed in the space between two worlds that had spent a long time deciding they had nothing to say to each other, and were now discovering that they'd been wrong about that. Jake, she said as he turned toward the door. He stopped, looked back. Whatever comes next, she said, whatever the machinery does, don't let them make you smaller than what you did out there. He held her eyes for a moment, nodded once, walked out. In the corridor, the taller officer fell into step beside him toward the elevator, not escorting him exactly, but present. They walked in silence for a few seconds. Then the officer said, quietly enough that it was clearly not for anyone else, For what it's worth, Matthews, what you did, I've got 12 years on the job, and I don't know if I would have stopped. Jake pressed the elevator button. The doors opened immediately. You would have, Jake said. You just would have been scared the whole time. He stepped in. The doors closed, and in the corridor behind him, the officer stood for a moment, alone with that, and found that he couldn't disagree. The story broke on a Thursday morning, and by Friday it had teeth. Not the soft, human interest version that Dana Yates had fed to the county paper. That one had been careful, measured, the kind of story that made people feel good and then forget about it by the weekend. This was something different. A national outlet had picked it up overnight, had added details from the original article and from the traffic camera description and from what appeared to be a source inside the department, and the headline they ran with was not gentle. Hell's Angel saves cop's life while her own department took 12 minutes to arrive. The implication was laid out plainly, methodically, in the particular way that journalists build implications when they want them to land hard and still be able to say they only reported facts. Pruitt read it at his desk at 6 in the morning with the same coffee he read everything with, and felt the specific sensation of a man watching a controlled burn become something else. By 8 o'clock, Captain Warren had called 3 times. By 9, the department's public information officer had issued a statement that satisfied nobody. By 10, there were 2 news vans in the parking lot outside, and a producer from a national morning show had called the front desk asking for Sergeant Pruitt specifically by name. Pruitt did not call the producer back. He called Jake Matthews instead. Jake picked up on the second ring. "I already know," he said. "How much do you know?" "Enough. It's been a busy morning." "Jake, I need you to understand what's happening here. This is not the county paper anymore. This is—" "I understand what it is," Jake said. His voice was even, not defensive, not alarmed. The voice of a man who has already processed the situation and moved to the next position. "What do you need from me?" Pruitt paused. He had expected more resistance, more complication. The directness of the question knocked him slightly off his prepared approach. "I need you to not talk to anyone. Press, media, anyone who contacts you that you don't personally know. Not yet. Not until we figure out what shape this is taking." "That I can do," Jake said. "I've got no interest in being on television." "Good, that's good." Pruitt rubbed his forehead. "There's something else." "Say it." "Warren wants a meeting, with you, in person, today if possible." A silence that lasted exactly long enough to be significant. "Warren," Jake said, "your captain." "Yes. The one with the particular opinions." "That's the one." Another silence. Jake let it sit there without filling it, which was one of the things Pruitt was starting to understand about him. He didn't rush the silence, didn't paper over it with words just because words were available. "Why?" Jake said finally. "Because this department is going to have to respond publicly to what happened, and Warren does not want to do that without having looked you in the eye first." Pruitt paused. "That's what he told me." "And what do you think he actually wants?" Pruitt looked at the news van through his office window. "I think he wants to figure out if you're a problem or an asset before he decides what story to tell. And I think, Jake, I think you're entitled to walk in there knowing that." Another long beat. "All right," Jake said. "When?" 2 o'clock. I'll be there." "I don't need you to hold my hand, Sergeant." "I know you don't," Pruitt said. "I'll be there anyway." Captain Gerald Warren was 61 years old and had been in law enforcement for 34 of those years, and had the face that those 34 years had made, not unkind, but settled into a firmness that had stopped being a posture and become a fact. He had opinions the way architecture has opinions, load-bearing, structural, not easily revised. He had looked at Jake Matthews' name in the initial incident report and felt something he would have described as professional skepticism, and which was, more honestly, the deep cellular resistance of a man encountering information that threatened something he'd spent a long time believing. He was standing when Jake came into the office. Pruitt was already there, in a chair to the left, doing the thing he did where he was present without being prominent. Women looked at Jake the way Jake had been looked at his entire adult life, scanning the cut, the tattoos, the posture, and then, with the visible effort of a man applying discipline to instinct, he moved his gaze to Jake's face and kept it there. "Mr. Matthews," Warren said, "thank you for coming." "Captain," Jake said. He did not extend a hand, neither did Warren. They stood across the desk from each other and assessed the situation with the mutual frankness of 2 men who had no use for pretense. "Sit down," Warren said. He sat too. He opened a folder on his desk, looked at something in it, closed it again. I'm going to be direct with you, Mr. Matthews, because I think direct is probably the only register that's going to work between us. Do you have any objection to that? None, Jake said. I have spent 34 years in law enforcement, 18 of those years in this department. I have had interactions with motorcycle clubs, with your club specifically, that have not been positive. I carry those interactions with me. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. He looked at Jake steadily. What I also carry with me is what I watched on that traffic camera footage this morning. All of it, start to finish, 3 times. Jake said nothing. He was watching Warren the way he'd watched the sergeant in the rain. Not warily, but completely, missing nothing. Officer Blake is one of the best officers in this department, Warren said, and something moved in his voice when he said it. Something that had nothing to do with professional assessment and everything to do with the fact that this was a person he knew. She is going to have a full recovery. The surgeon told me this morning. He paused. She would not be having that recovery without you. She did most of the work, Jake said. I just gave her something to push against. Warren looked at him. Something shifted in the captain's face. Something small but real. The movement of a man filing away a piece of information that contradicted a long-held assumption and choosing, with some internal effort, to file it accurately. The media situation, Warren said, shifting forward slightly. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by pretending it isn't a factor in this conversation. It is. What I want to know from you directly, what do you want out of this? Because right now, Mr. Matthews, you have significant leverage. The story is framing you as a hero and framing this department as slow. If you wanted to exploit that, you could. Jake looked at him for a long moment. I want Officer Blake to get her 10 days, he said, and I want to go home. Warren stared at him. That's it. That's it. You don't want... There's no... Warren stopped. He looked at Pruitt. Pruitt's expression communicated nothing helpful. Warren looked back at Jake. You came in here. You have every camera in the country pointed at you right now. You have media that would give you significant platform and significant payment, and you want nothing. I want the story to be accurate, Jake said, which means I want people to know that a deer came off a tree line on a county highway and your officer swerved and lost control and ended up in a ditch. Not because of equipment failure, not because of staffing shortage, not because of anything your department did or didn't do. It was an accident. She needed help. I was there. He paused. If your department wants to make something out of it, that's up to you. But don't make it into something it isn't. The room was very quiet. Warren leaned back in his chair. He looked at Jake Matthews, really looked at him, in the way that men who have been certain about something for a long time look at the thing that is asking them to be less certain. And whatever he found in that looking, he kept it to himself. But his posture changed, very slightly. The load-bearing firmness of it shifted, just barely, into something that had a little more room in it. There's going to be a formal commendation, Warren said, from this department. It's not optional. The city council is already asking. The media is already asking. And frankly, Officer Blake is already asking, which in my experience means it's going to happen whether I authorize it or not. He looked at Jake with something that was almost dry. Will you accept it? Does it require me to be on television? There would be a public ceremony, brief. Jake looked at Pruitt. Pruitt looked at his hands. No help there. Jake looked back at Warren. If Rachel wants it, he said, then I'll show up. Warren nodded. He closed the folder on his desk again. He stood up, which was the signal that the conversation had reached its functional end. Jake stood too, and then Warren did something that he would not have predicted himself doing 24 hours earlier. He extended his hand across the desk. Jake looked at it, looked at Warren. Then he reached across and shook it. Off the record, Warren said, and I mean it, what I'm about to say does not leave this room. Jake waited. I was wrong about what I assumed when I read your name in that report, Warren said. I was wrong before I saw the footage, and I would have been wrong after it if I'd let myself be. I don't say that easily. Jake held the handshake for another second. I know you don't, he said. He let go, picked up his cut from the chair. Captain. He walked out. Pruitt followed him into the hallway, caught up to him at the elevator. Jake. Jake stopped, turned. There's one more thing, Pruitt said, and it didn't come from me. All right. There's a member of your chapter, goes by the name Church. Older guy, 60s I think, been with the Angels since before you were patched in. Pruitt watched him carefully. He came by the department this morning, not to cause trouble. He came to the front desk and asked if Officer Blake had received the flowers. Jake went very still. What flowers? Whoever sent them used a card that said, "From a few of the boys," Pruitt said. Hargrove Angels chapter address in the return. Big arrangement, lilies, and I don't know, I'm not a florist. But they're in her room right now, and Rachel cried when she got them, which I am also telling you did not come from me. Jake looked at the elevator, at the closed doors, at his own reflection broken across the metal. The chapter had sent flowers to a cop, without telling him, without making it about him or about optics or about anything except the plain human fact of a woman lying in a hospital bed. He felt something move through him that he didn't have a clean name for. Pride was part of it. Something older than pride was the rest. Church sent flowers, Jake said, to no one in particular. Big ones, Pruitt said. Jake pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. He stepped in, and this time he didn't say anything clever on the way out, and Pruitt understood that some things were complete without a closing line. The commendation ceremony was set for the following Thursday, 9 days after the accident, 1 day before Rachel Blake was scheduled to be discharged. The city had booked the steps of the municipal building, which seated a crowd of approximately 200 if you counted generously. And by the morning of the event, it was clear that 200 was going to be a significant underestimate. Jake found out about the crowd size from Dozer, who found out from a scanner, who called Jake at 7 in the morning and said, "Brother, you might want to prepare yourself," in the tone of someone who has seen something remarkable and is still processing it. Jake did not prepare himself. He put on a clean shirt, put on his cut, and rode to the municipal building alone. He arrived 20 minutes early and stood at the back of the gathering crowd and watched the thing that had grown out of a rainy night on Route 9 and felt something that he would have been unable to articulate, but that existed somewhere in the range of awe. There were people there he didn't know, a lot of them. There were people holding signs, not protest signs, not the kind of signs people brought to political things, but handmade signs, the kind that took time, the kind that someone had sat at a kitchen table and made because they needed to do something with what they were feeling. One of them said simply, "Thank you, Jake." Another said, "This is what a hero looks like." A third one, held by a woman who looked to be in her 70s, said, "My son is a Hell's Angel," and he would have stopped too. Jake looked at that last one for a long time. Calloway found him at the back of the crowd. The young officer was in his dress uniform, hat squared, looking both more formal and more uncertain than Jake had yet seen him. He came and stood beside Jake and looked at the crowd with the expression of someone who was recalibrating something fundamental. "Did you know it was going to be like this?" Calloway said. "No," Jake said. "Does it feel weird?" Jake considered that honestly. "Yeah," he said, "it does. Is it a good weird or—" "I don't know yet," Jake said. "Ask me after." Then Rachel came out. She was in uniform, not the full dress uniform, but her regular duty uniform, which her surgeon had apparently tried to argue against, and which Rachel had apparently found unpersuasive as an argument. She walked with a cane that she was clearly furious about, but tolerating, and she walked up those steps with her back straight and her jaw set, and that particular quality of presence that certain people have, the quality that makes a room pay attention without requiring anything as crude as volume. She found Jake in the crowd immediately. Even at that distance across 200 people, she found him like he was the only fixed point in the frame. She held his gaze for a moment, then she nodded, once, small, certain, and turned to face the gathered crowd and the cameras and the mayor and all the machinery of a public moment. Jake nodded back at no one in particular. He straightened his cut. He stood his ground. Whatever he had expected his life to look like the week after a rainy night on Route 9, it had not looked like this. But then he had not expected to stop that night either. And look at what stopping had done. The mayor's name was Patricia Hollins, and she had been in office for 6 years and had the particular skill of knowing when a moment was larger than her prepared remarks. She looked out at the crowd that had gathered on those municipal steps, the 200 that had become closer to 400, the signs, the cameras, the off-duty officers in civilian clothes who had come anyway, the woman in her 70s still holding her handmade sign about her son, and she set her notes on the podium and did not look at them again. She spoke for 4 minutes. She spoke about what it meant to help someone when helping was hard. She spoke about the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. She spoke about the night on Route 9 and about what the traffic cameras showed and about what it meant that the first person to stop, the only person to stop, in 13 minutes of rain and dark and emergency, had been a man that most people in that crowd would have crossed the street to avoid. She did not use the word unlikely. She did not use the word surprising. She said what she meant directly, which was that character revealed itself in the moments when no one was watching and there was nothing to gain, and that what Jake Matthews had revealed of his character on that highway was something this city intended to acknowledge with clarity and without qualification. Jake stood at the back of the crowd and listened, and felt the particular discomfort of hearing himself described out loud by someone who didn't know him, even when what they were saying was accurate. It was not false modesty. It was just that the version of himself in the mayor's words was flatter than the real thing, cleaner, and he was aware of the distance between the story people were telling and the actual night, the rain, the blood, the way Rachel's voice had come in and out like a radio signal, the way his arms had shaken and he hadn't let them stop. The real night was not a story. The real night was just something that happened to 2 people on a highway and left marks on both of them that no ceremony was going to resolve. Rachel spoke after the mayor. She walked to the podium with her cane and her fury at the cane and stood there in the October morning air with the gathered crowd going quiet in the way crowds go quiet when they understand that what they're about to hear matters. She talked for a while about what she remembered. She said that she remembered the rain and the specific wrongness of the angle she was at inside the car, and the way her side felt like something had been driven through it and was still there. She said she remembered darkness around the edges, the particular kind of darkness that is not sleep and not unconsciousness, but something quieter than both, something that was coming for her the way water comes into a basement, not all at once, not dramatically, just steadily, inevitably, from every direction at once. And then she said, and I heard a voice. I heard a voice say, "Hey, look at me." And I want to be honest with you. My first thought was not gratitude. My first thought was, this is not how I wanted to go. And my second thought was, I am not going anywhere because this man will not let me. The crowd was completely still. Jake Matthews did not save my life by accident, Rachel said. He saved it on purpose. He made a decision, a fast one, an unambiguous one, in the middle of a dark road where nobody was watching him and nobody would have blamed him for riding past. He made that decision because of who he is, not because of who I am, not because of the uniform, because of who he is. She paused. I think that's worth saying plainly. Jake became aware that Calloway was standing directly to his left, and that Calloway's jaw was tight in the way jaws go tight when someone is working against a feeling that caught them off guard. He did not comment on this. He kept his eyes on Rachel. I've been asked in the last 9 days, Rachel continued, whether this changes how I do my job, whether I'm going to look at a Hell's Angels patch differently now, whether one person's act undoes a category. She looked out at the crowd. That's the wrong question. The right question is whether I was ever right to reduce a person to a category in the first place. And the honest answer is no. The honest answer is that Jake Matthews was always more than what I assumed. I just needed a rainy night and a wound and 12 minutes in a ditch to find that out. Someone in the crowd started clapping before she'd finished her last sentence. Not from impatience, from the overflow of something that had been building and needed somewhere to go. And then it spread, and it became the kind of applause that a crowd produces when it has collectively arrived at a feeling and is expressing it without self-consciousness, without performance, just with the sheer physical fact of hands coming together. Jake stood in the back of it and let it happen around him. Then Rachel said, "Jake, would you come up here?" He had known it was coming. He had agreed to it, in the abstract, in the way you agree to things that don't seem quite real yet. But now it was real. 400 people, and a podium, and Rachel Blake standing at it with her cane in the morning light, and her eyes finding him in the crowd with the precision she'd used from 30 feet in a hospital room. And the abstract became immediate in a way that moved through him differently than he'd expected. He walked through the crowd. The crowd parted without being asked. People moved for him the way water moves for something certain, and he was aware of hands, not grabbing, just reaching, touching his shoulder, his arm, his back, brief and light, the physical language of acknowledgement from people who didn't have words ready. An older man looked him in the eye and said nothing, but nodded, once, deeply, the nod of one generation recognizing something in another. A woman pressed a hand to her mouth. The woman with the sign, the one about her son, was crying, openly, without embarrassment, and when Jake passed her, she reached out and gripped his forearm for just a moment, and he let her. He climbed the steps, stood beside Rachel, faced the crowd. Warren was there, to the left of the podium, in his full dress uniform, his expression carefully composed into something that was neither the hostility of 9 days ago nor the performed warmth of public occasions, but something more difficult and more honest. The face of a man in the middle of a change he hadn't chosen, but was no longer resisting. The mayor presented the commendation. It was a framed certificate and a medallion on a ribbon and a handshake that the cameras caught from 17 different angles. Jake held the frame in both hands and looked at it, and then looked up at Rachel and said, quietly enough that the microphone didn't catch it, "You're going to hate the desk duty." She said, equally quietly, "I'm starting Monday." "That's 6 days." "I negotiated." He almost laughed. He caught it, turned it into something smaller, but not before Rachel saw it, and the thing that crossed her face in response was uncomplicated and real, and worth all 12 of those minutes in the rain. They stood at the podium together for the photographs that the cameras required, and Jake held himself the way he always held himself, straight, present, not performing anything. And Rachel stood beside him with her chin up and her hand loose on the cane. And Pruitt, watching from the side, thought that the photograph of the two of them was going to outlast a lot of things in this county. He thought it was going to end up on a wall somewhere and stay there. He was right about that, but he didn't know yet what else it was going to do. What happened next, what none of them had seen coming, what turned the ceremony from a local event into something that continued to move through the world long after the cameras packed up, started with a phone call to the department the following morning. The call came from a veterans organization 3 states over. A man named Gerald, who ran a chapter for veterans experiencing housing instability, who had seen the story online and then watched a clip of the ceremony and had called the Hargrove County Sheriff's Department's general line and asked, with the directness of someone who had learned not to waste words, whether Jake Matthews would be willing to speak to a group of 60 veterans who were struggling with what Gerald called the problem of being misread. Pruitt took the call. He sat with it for a moment. Then he called Jake. "You're going to think this is strange," Pruitt said, I already think most things are strange, Jake said. Go ahead. Pruitt told him about Gerald and the veterans and the request. He laid it out plainly and waited for Jake to tell him it was outside the scope of anything he'd agreed to. Instead, Jake said, "What does he need from me specifically?" Pruitt blinked. He said he just wants you to talk about the night on Route 9, about the decision to stop. A pause. He said his guys know what it's like to do something right and have people see only what you are on the outside. He thought you might know that too. Jake was quiet for a long moment. The particular quiet of a man hearing something land in a place he hadn't known was open. "When does he need an answer?" Jake said. He said, "Whenever you're ready." "Tell him Saturday," Jake said. "Tell him I'll come on Saturday." Pruitt put down the phone and sat for a moment with his hands flat on his desk. He thought about the night 9 days ago when he had reviewed the traffic camera footage 3 times and then called Rachel's room. He thought about the chain of events that had unfolded from a single decision on a dark highway. He thought about 60 veterans in a room 3 states over, waiting for a man in a Hells Angels cut to come and talk to them about being misread, about doing the right thing inside a world that had already decided who you were. He thought about how far a stopped motorcycle could travel. He picked up his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. On Friday, Rachel was discharged. Calloway drove her home. She had asked him specifically, which had surprised him enough that he'd asked her twice if she was sure. And she had looked at him with the expression she used for questions that didn't need to be asked twice. In the car, she was quiet for the first few miles, looking out the window at the county she'd driven for 7 years, at the roads she knew the way she knew her own hands. "Calloway," she said. "Ma'am, what you said to me in the hospital about having your hand on your weapon." He kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah, I've been thinking about it. Okay? I want to tell you something and I want you to hear it correctly." She turned slightly toward him. "What you did, coming to tell me, admitting what you were thinking, that took something. It took honesty about yourself that a lot of people in this job never find." She paused. "Don't waste it. Take that honesty and do something with it. Something that matters." Calloway drove. His hands were steady on the wheel, but his jaw was working, the same way it had worked at the ceremony when the feeling had caught him off guard. "What did you do with it?" he said. "After the night on Route 9, when you realized—" "I'm still doing it," Rachel said. "Every day. That's how it works." He nodded, drove, said nothing else. He didn't need to. When he pulled up to her house, she got out with her cane and her discharge papers, and the particular expression of someone returning to their own life after a detour that had rerouted something permanent. She got to the door and turned back. Calloway had the window down. "Thank you," she said, "for the drive." "Any time," he said. She went inside. Calloway sat in the driveway for a moment before pulling away. And in that moment, he made the kind of quiet decision that doesn't announce itself, but holds for a long time. The decision about who he was going to be going forward, and what he was going to do with the honesty he'd found in a hospital doorway with his hat in his hands. He pulled away. He drove back to the department. He had work to do. The Saturday meeting with Gerald's veterans group was supposed to last an hour. It lasted 3.5. Jake talked for the first 20 minutes and answered questions for the rest. And the questions were not soft. They were the questions of men who had been through things and wanted to understand how a person keeps their humanity intact when the world has decided to read them as a threat. Jake answered them the only way he knew how, directly, without polish, without the soft edges of a man performing openness. He told them the truth, which was that you couldn't control what people decided about you before you opened your mouth. You could only control what you did when it mattered. A man toward the back, older, heavy around the shoulders, the specific quiet of someone who had been carrying something for a long time, raised his hand and said, "Did you think about it? When you saw her?" Did you think about whether to stop? Jake looked at him. No, he said. Not at all? Not at all. Why not? Jake thought about that, about the rain, about the headlight carving its tunnel through the dark, about the lights in the ditch, and the moment before momentum, and the moment after it when everything had already been decided. Because she was bleeding, Jake said, and I was there. That's the whole equation. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the man with the heavy shoulders nodded, slowly, deeply, the nod of someone who has been waiting a long time to hear something put exactly that way. And he didn't say anything else, and he didn't need to. That was the moment that Pruitt heard about later, from Gerald, who described it with the careful words of someone trying to preserve something precise. That was the moment Pruitt wrote down, in the margin of the incident report he kept in the file, in his own handwriting. The whole equation. 3 months later, Rachel Blake returned to full duty. She came back on a Tuesday morning and drove Route 9 for the first time since the accident. Drove the stretch of road she knew, past the shoulder where the grass was still growing back in the spot where a Harley-Davidson had once pulled over in the dark. She drove past it without stopping. She noted it. She kept going. She had a full shift ahead of her. She had work to do. And Jake Matthews, 3 counties over, was already on the road. The morning was clear and cold and wide, and the highway went out ahead of him in a long, straight line. And he rode it the way he'd always ridden everything, forward, eyes open, hands steady. Some men are remembered for what they said, some for what they built. Jake Matthews would be remembered for the moment when stopping was harder than riding, and he stopped anyway. And in that one unhesitating moment, proved that the truest measure of a man has never been the patch on his chest, but the decision he makes in the dark, when no one is watching and everything is on the line.